Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Johannes Lichtman in support of his new novel, Calling Ukraine, and in conversation this evening with author Chris McCormick. Just a quick webinar overview for our attendees. If you're just joining us, the chat is closed, but you can keep the chat window open. I'll be sharing links to purchase books from Literati Bookstore throughout the event in the chat. You can interact with us at any time, using the Q&A that's available to you on your toolbar. So if you have a question for the author, whenever the spirit moves you, please feel free to submit your questions. I'll read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of the conversation. And live transcription is available to you on your toolbar as well. If you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books in the description directly below me. And you can click on the typewriter icon on the bottom right corner of the video to subscribe to our channel and be kept up to date with all of our At Home with Literati events once they become available there. And if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area, of course, you can shop for books right in our store. We're open to the public Monday through Sunday. And if you don't, you can shop for books online to ship anywhere in the United States at literatibookstore.com. You can also sign up for our newsletter while you're there as well to be kept appraised of all of our events, virtual or otherwise. And we thank you for it. But most of all, we'd like to thank you for your attendance this evening, or this morning, or this afternoon, or much later this evening, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. Johannes Lichtman's debut novel, Such Good Work, was chosen as a 5 under 35 honoree by the National Book Foundation. His work has appeared in Tin House, The Sun, Travel and Leisure, Los Angeles Review of Books, Oxford American, and elsewhere. He lives in Washington, D.C. Speaking with him this evening, Chris McCormick is the author of The Gimmicks and Desert Boys, a collection of stories, which won the Stonewall Book Award. Raised on the California side of the Mojave Desert, he's a graduate of the University of Michigan's MFA program and lives and teaches in Minnesota. Please join me in welcoming to our virtual bookstore and to your living rooms, Johannes Lichtman and Chris McCormick.
Thank you, John.
Thanks so much, John. Thank you, Literati Bookstore, a place near and dear to my heart. Thank you, Johannes, for joining us tonight.
Thanks, buddy.
And congratulations. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate you wearing the exact same shirt I wore. That's really nice.
If you sit a little straighter, you can see a red emblem on your shirt that distinguishes yours from mine. So let's do that. So happy to see you and to be able to talk to you about this book, which as soon as I finished reading an advance copy, I texted you. I said, this is my favorite novel I've read in a long time. It is the funniest book I've read in a while. It's surprisingly moving. It's about gigantic global forces. It's about small personal questions like ambition and disappointment. It's a gigantic, ambitious novel, but also like eminently readable and not overwhelmingly heavy, which I appreciated too. And I'm just really proud of you as a friend and as a reader. I thought I'd ask you a couple questions to get the conversation going, and then if you could read a little bit from the book, that would be wonderful. And then we'll come back to the conversation again after that. And I think the first conversation, just to start us off, is about your time living in Ukraine, in this kind of interstitial space after the Maidan Revolution, before the Russian invasion. And thinking, as I'm reading the book, I'm thinking about Ukraine as this interstitial space in many ways between European forces, Russian forces. And there's this beautiful passage in the book where John, our protagonist, is walking around a park and it's Europe in one moment, and then suddenly it's the Soviet Union. It's almost between times too, this place. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how you came to live in Ukraine, what that experience of being, is that betweenness a palpable experience for you as a person and a writer living there, and how you came to want to write about that experience in a very different context where the character is very different in a situation that's much more comic and dramatic than yours maybe, but yeah, give us a little bit of that initial experience.
Yeah, absolutely. First off, thank you for the nice things you said about the book. And I think that you're right on the money talking about sort of this interstitial space of Ukraine and sort of the way sometimes being there felt like moving through time periods, and moving through Western European and Soviet architecture and city planning and, all kinds of stuff. But to just back up a little bit, I moved to Ukraine, to Lutsk, which is a city in northwestern Ukraine, a little north of Lviv, near the Polish border, in 2018. My partner Sherry had gotten a Fulbright fellowship to teach English, but also media literacy and pedagogy in Ukraine. She had worked with Ukrainian refugees resettled to America before, so this was a great opportunity for her to go. And I wanted to be where she was, so I also went. So she was there on a Fulbright, and as I often joked to the laughter of no one, I was there on a half-bright. And you're the target demographic for that joke because you love stupid puns.
So and I'm so sorry that I was muted while I was hysterically laughing. I promise I was laughing loudly.
It's all good. So I was, the character in the book moves to the same city. And the book takes place in 2018 and 2019, which, as Chris noted, is a really important time in Ukrainian history because it's after the Maidan Revolution that broke Ukraine free from the Russian sphere of influence and brought it closer to the EU and the West, and before the full-scale Russian invasion in 2022. So it was a time of, at least when I was living there, and I'm always speaking from my small experience as one person in one city in Ukraine, so I obviously can't sum up the whole country, but during the time I was living there, it seemed like a time of great energy and hope. There was a lot of possibilities for young people, especially young people who could speak English, to work with countries or companies from Ireland and the US and the rest of Europe, and to make a lot more money. And there was opportunity to start businesses. It felt like it was a time when a lot of people in Ukraine, a lot of young Ukrainians were building things, whether it was their own business, whether it was literary festivals, whether it was cafes. So it was a really interesting time to be there. I was, the character in the novel moves there to run a call center for an American short-term rental startup. They have outsourced their call center to Lutsk. And his job is to teach call center agents to sound more American. That was not why I was there. I was there, to be with my partner and to write. So I was working on a different project there, and I would go to a co-working space. It's the one co-working space in town in Lutsk, and I met a lot of great people there who ended up being friends. And then one day the co-working space closed, and I needed to find a new place to work, which is a little bit more difficult in, Lutsk is a city of about 250,000 people, but it's a little bit harder than it would be in an American city of the same size for various reasons. But I had a friend who worked at an American company in Lutsk, and he said, "Hey, I work at a call center. We have a free desk. Would you like to rent it? I can ask the boss. We got good Wi-Fi, we got reliable electricity and plumbing, which, kind of all the things I was looking for." And the boss said, "Yeah, it'd be great to have an American in the office. Like, even if he's not working for us, like, he takes coffee breaks and stuff, he'll probably help everyone sound more American." Which I don't know actually ended up happening, but I had a great time working there. So I spent a couple months going every day and writing in a call center. So I overheard, a lot of calls of Ukrainian customer service reps helping Americans, and I had a lot of conversations, and that kind of formed the inspiration for the reason that my protagonist is in Ukraine.
And becomes the foundation for a lot of the comedy and ultimately the tragedy and the action of the novel, this question of communication and miscommunication. We'll get to that, I'm sure. As you were talking about that time of hopefulness in Ukraine, I want to just mention, as I was reading the book, I think there's a layer of reflective tragedy. There is hope in the book that you can't help but see through the lens of current events, and I saw that it was important to you to leave an author's note at the beginning of the book talking about the contextual change since you started writing the book and what your decisions were revising the book. Do you want to say anything about that decision to leave that note in the book and why you felt it was so important?
Yeah, absolutely. So I wrote this book mainly in 2020, and publication cycles take a long time. So between the time I finished writing the book and the time it came out, something really monumental happened, obviously. And that's not what my book is about. The Russian invasion is not what my book's about, and how my book is perceived in the context of this invasion is so insignificant that it's laughable. But since we're all here, I'll just talk about it. But I think that the publisher was great about being respectful, about, not exploiting or not marketing the book in a way that felt like it was exploitive, and about letting me put a note in the beginning of the book explaining that the book was written before the invasion. And I didn't change much. After the invasion, everything felt different. Of course, for Ukrainians, it really felt different. But even just writing about the country, it felt like there was a totally new context. And humor felt like out of place. And then also writing, I have a narrator who's coming to Ukraine for the first time. And there's a lot of negative things, especially in the beginning, that he says or thinks or is told about Ukraine. And that felt kind of inappropriate given the context of what was happening and given the bravery and suffering of the Ukrainian people. But the more I tried to kind of change it and edit it and make it more, pro-Ukrainian, which I think it's already pro-Ukrainian, but to make it more sensitive to the new reality, the less real it felt and the less alive it felt. And it felt like I was stripping away the humanity of the characters and making them less like the Ukrainian people I knew and more like, just symbols of goodness. And that doesn't help anyone. And I think the humor was such a big part of my time in Ukraine. I think it's a big part of Ukrainian culture. I don't think it's an accident that their president is a comedian. So I think that keeping that humor in, and keeping most of the stuff intact felt like the right decision for me. But at the same time, it's wartime. And during wartime, it's very hard to read anything, but fiction as well, with nuance or shades of gray. So, I think there have been responses to the book that feel like that was the wrong decision. And I respect that. I think people are certainly entitled to feel that way. But given what I knew and what I was trying to do, it felt like the best thing I could do.
I'm so glad you did it. Personally, the book feels so alive, and I won't defend you against any misreadings of the book, but just know that I think you made the right choice there. And let's talk about your narrator and your protagonist of the novel, John Turner, the American in Ukraine. As you mentioned, brought to the country to teach idiomatic American English and try to soften the edges of some of the directness of the English spoken at those school centers.
Would this be a good time for me to read a little bit, since the passage is just about that?
Perfect. And I'd love to, just get a sense of his personality as you're reading it. Yep. Yeah.
I'm just gonna read for about 8 minutes from the beginning of the book here, and then we'll talk some about the protagonist, but you'll have a better sense of what Chris is talking about. And this is just from the beginning of the book. And John has just arrived in Lutsk, which, as I said, a mid-sized city in northwestern Ukraine. And this is the first time that he is coming into the office of the call center that he's supposed to run. And he's being shown around by Dima, who's a Ukrainian software developer. All right. Dima showed me around the office, which looked like the set from a movie about the 2000s American tech boom. Beanbag chairs, a gaming console, and desk pods filled an open single room, built under the idea that employees wouldn't hate their coworkers enough to need walls or doors. At the center of the room were 8 software developers' desks with big monitors, but my domain was the 5 call center desks near the door. The agents were just settling in for their 4 p.m. to midnight shift. 2 of the agents were boys who couldn't have been more than 21, and 2 were women in their late 20s to early 30s. One of the desks was empty, but no sooner had I noticed its vacancy than the door opened and a woman walked in. She was about my age, with long brown hair that crested over her forehead in a wave. She was fair, slim without being bony, and in washed-out jeans with white sneakers and a beige corduroy jacket struck me as the perfect outfit for the day. I had worked for many managers, but had never been a manager of myself, and I was determined to be a good, bland boss who made my employees' jobs easier without having any effect on their personal lives. So it was with dismay that I found myself so immediately attracted to her. I introduced myself to all the agents, and when I got to her and she said her name was Natalie, I tried to banish the thought that we had known each other in a previous life, which, despite my not believing in past lives, was a thought that often hit me when I was attracted to a woman. It's nice to meet you, I said and shook her hand. But how could you possibly know? Natalie said. How could I know what? That it's nice to meet me. It's an American expression, said a woman I assumed was Oksana, the English teacher. She had appeared from nowhere and was now right in front of me, wearing bright red lipstick, a knee-length red skirt, black leather boots, a black top, and a red blazer. Her hair was blonde, her fingernails were painted red, and while I couldn't tell if she was in her 30s, 40s, or 50s, she had the vibe of someone who would never die. You know this, she said. Natalia shrugged at Oksana in a way that could have meant anything. I shook Oksana's hand and told her that it was nice to meet her too. Frankly speaking, she said, it is my pleasure, while wordlessly conveying that it was very much not. I assumed that my hiring was a demotion for her, which meant that there was no reason for her to like me. But there was something in me that believed that everyone should like me, and it unnerved me that she didn't. When I turned to address the room, I found my mouth was dry. My shirt, a designer white button-up recently returned from the airline when they found my luggage, which just an hour earlier had fit perfectly, was now too tight in the shoulders, bunched up at the waist, and sticking to my armpits from the sweat. I hadn't expected to be nervous. I was teaching them how to speak English like an American, which was one of the few topics on which I could be called an expert. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Turner, and I'm really looking forward to working with you. I apologized for being late, explained why I'd been stranded in Kyiv waiting for my luggage, then regretted the apology as it probably made me look weak. I felt the dryness spreading across my tongue and looked up at the clock on the wall, which read 3:54. We only have a few minutes before lines open today, but let's do a little warm-up. How's everyone doing today? There was silence, which I'd expected from Davy's warning. Kyle, I said to a boy with a blonde crew cut. How you doing today? So far, so good, said Kyle. Very good. And what's your real name, Kyle? Kyle. Great, I said. I didn't know whether it was more insulting to call the agents by their American names or insist that they give me their Ukrainian names, but I decided to push this question back to another day. And what would you ask me, Kyle, if I were a customer and we were going to make small talk? How is your day going, sir? It's going pretty well. I'm loving this weather we're having. There was silence for a while. My father doesn't like the heat, said Andy, but he has been very morose since my mother became ill. I paused. So this is what we call a good teaching moment, Andy. Very sorry to hear about your mother, and morose is a high-level word in English, so well done there. But your mother's illness is not something you want to talk to the customers about. It might make them uncomfortable. When they ask how you're doing, Oksana said, they don't really want to know how you're doing. They're lying. While Oksana is correct, sort of, I said, I wouldn't say they're lying. It's just they want a very limited answer to the question. It's not a lie so much as a euphemism. Does anyone know what a euphemism is? It's when you use one word or phrase to disguise another word or phrase that might be unpleasing to the listener, Oksana said. Like water closet for toilet. Yes, that's correct, Oksana. But I was hoping that the agents could. But tell me, please, Oksana said. How are you doing a euphemism? What unpleasing word or phrase are you attempting to disguise? The heat ran into my face with the realization that it was not a euphemism. I should have prepared better. Davy had said that the Ukrainians were so quiet, but Oksana was not quiet. I panicked and tried to remember what a preposition was, just in case she brought up prepositions. That's a very good point, Oksana. So in this example, they're trying to disguise the fact that, as you said, they don't really care how you're doing. They're checking the box of being polite while, tell me please, she said, what do you mean by checking the box? My objectives, as Davy had laid them out, were to guide the agents through the art of small talk, improve their ability to sound natural and conversational, and reduce the average call time from 12 to 8 minutes so that the agents could start taking on email and chat tickets as well. It was only now that I was realizing that I had no idea how I was supposed to accomplish any of this. Luckily, we were out of time. That's a great question. But it's almost 4 o'clock, which means it's almost 9 a.m. in New York. So we'll have to put a pin in this, I said, rushing forward as I realized I'd used another euphemism. But I'm really looking forward to picking it up tomorrow. I retreated to my desk by the back wall of the office. Davy had somehow convinced me that I would be useful here just by virtue of my presence, and I felt very stupid for having believed him. I took out my laptop and spent the rest of the shift doing what I should have been doing since I accepted the job offer, researching how to run quality control for customer support. Right, and I'll leave off there.
It's such a great scene to give us a flavor of this guy's personality, which, God, he means so well, and he really wants to do a good job, and he takes this job very seriously, but he's also so self-conscious and constantly second guessing, and then realizes his mistakes too late and then dwells on his mistakes. And it becomes, like I said, a huge source of the comedy in the novel, but it also leads to some of the surprising events later in the book in ways that remind me of the connection between comedy and tragedy. But let me ask you about the kind of the powers of a narrator like that, a narrator who's so conscientious and so self-conscious and careful. That seems to me like a great source maybe for compassion as a narrator and those kinds of qualities that you would hope for a narrator. Are there also limitations with a narrator like that? How are you able to keep that narrative mind so well organized in a story that's extremely suspenseful, active, and taut, I think?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, so having a super contemplative narrator is what I always do for no reason, because that doesn't reflect my own personality at all. But I think that in this particular book, having him be so thinky is evened out by then having him take a lot of decisive actions, some of which go well and some of them which go really, tragically. They're all well-intentioned, but they aren't all good actions, right? So he's someone who's trying to do good and not always doing a very good job at it, which is a topic that I keep coming back to because it always fascinates me. Like when you have super self-aware characters who can plan 5 steps ahead and come up with every criticism of all their actions, and they're self-aware enough to know everything wrong with what they're doing, but they still want to engage with the world and they still want to try to make a difference. And that was something that I tried to explore in my first book, and it's something that I try to explore here. And here it's like on a much more visceral, violent level, because things get out of hand. With John himself as a character, it's interesting. Your take on him is I really like. I think a lot of readers like that I've gotten feedback from like the way he narrates the book. They don't necessarily like him as a character, which I think is fair. It's always odd when you get, especially with like the first book, when you get like feedback, which is like, this is clearly autobiographical. I hate the narrator. Great book. And it's like, I don't know how to feel about any of that. But in this one, I think it's a little bit more clear that it's not. I think that the clarity of the fiction is a little bit clearer, so there's a little bit more separation. But I think when you are trying to be self-aware and trying to write in a way that shows self-awareness, if you are from my demographic or our demographic, I think there's a big trend in literature right now to write characters who are either so passive and righteous that they can't be objectionable, or characters who are so depraved and terrible that it's clear that there's a separation between the evil character and the good author, and that the author is aware of all the problems that come with, being a white man today, or at any time, but today, because we're writing today. And I think that I totally understand both those impulses, because you don't want to be wrong and you want to be liked, and I want to be liked too. But I also think that sometimes, or actually kind of often, those impulses can lead to fiction that's not that interesting, and that I really like at least trying to carve out characters who are really sympathetic sometimes and really unsympathetic other times. And it kind of depends on the action. It kind of depends on the day and the reader. And who are often wrong, because, just because you're right doesn't mean you're interesting. And I think that there's a lot of fiction that tries to be right and is right, but maybe isn't so fun to read. And that's not to say that like mine's super fun to read, but this is just the way I'm trying to approach it. So John does a lot of things that are kind of objectionable. I mean, he, right before the passage I read, he talks about the fraught history of American men and Ukrainian women, and how, especially in the 90s, it's less of a thing now, but in the 90s, when things were really hard in Ukraine, it was called in Ukraine the hard 90s, following the fall of communism and sort of the rise of robber barons, or oligarchs as they're called there. And, there was a lot of American, Canadian, and British men trying to kind of take advantage of the situation by marrying Ukrainian women who are much more beautiful than them and would never have, married them in a normal situation, but they have a passport, right? So there's this fraught history, and it's a Ukrainian writer called Natalia Antonova. Sorry, Natalia Antonova, for butchering your name, who called these types of tourists sexpats. And I think that it's very apt, and it's still a cultural legacy, even if it's not as present anymore. So, so John's very aware of that. And he goes to Ukraine saying, I'm going to be celibate the whole time I'm here, because I'm not going to be a part of this imperialist, problem. And then as soon as he gets to the office, he's like, oh no, I'm so attracted to this woman. And it's an impulse he fights a lot. And, you read the book, you see what happens. But just because he's aware of a problem doesn't mean he's exempt from it. And I also, I'm going to get just a little bit insufferable for a second here. But for me, the book is an allegory. And God, it feels really pretentious just even saying that. But Natalia represents Ukraine, and John represents the United States, and a third character, her husband, Anatoly, represents Russia. And in this allegory, it's kind of like, the United States may, you're on mute, Chris. Are you saying something?
I was just mind blown, and I was whispering to myself that's incredible. I didn't read it that way, and I'm remembering the book in a new light and mesmerized by that. Yeah.
Well, thank you for validating the allegory. And so Natalia as Ukraine, like, Russia might say, oh, you're my, I love you, we're the same. But then when you don't do exactly what Russia wants, it's met with violence, which is what happens with Anatoly and Natalia, to oversimplify. And the United States may say, I want to help you. Let me help you. Let me give you money. Let me help you out of this. But then when things go south, is America really there to help? Usually not. So if Ukraine is to survive and thrive, and if Natalia is to survive and thrive, she has to figure out how to do it on her own. And in order for John to symbolize the United States, if you look at our history of foreign policy, if we put it in the most generous context possible, there's a lot of instances of trying to do good and leaving things a real mess. And I think that the first part, you could definitely argue with how much good we were trying to do in various situations. But let's just say for now that sometimes we were trying to do good and things got much worse because of our actions. So in order for that to work, like, John has to mess up some. So that becomes, part of his character. As I'm describing this to you, I'm remembering when a couple months ago, before the book was coming out, we were working on, the jacket copy, the description of the book on the back. And I was on a Zoom with some people from the publishing house who are great. And they were throwing out some ideas for how to pitch the book and how to market it and doing jacket copy. And they were like, so do you have any ideas? And I was like, well, I'm not sure if this is what you're looking for, but the book is an allegory. And John represents, and then, cut to 5 minutes later, and the IMF money and the EU influence, but that's not going to change and in the nicest way possible, they said no, which was, I can't remember if it was my editor or my great marketing person who said, I think that would be great for the paperback reading group guide. It's a bananas thing to put on a book cover, or put on a book jacket. But yeah, I hope that answers your question in a very long way.
It does. And Yeah, I'm glad. I love that reading of it, but it's nice to let the reader read the book instead of the checker copy. I like that idea. Not spoiling anything, but we should talk a little bit about one of the ways I felt John's self-conscious or serious consideration of everything and everyone in the book gets freed up a little bit, is that it's not just his seeing Ukraine. It's not just his experience of the mirror is cast on him too in really interesting ways. You know, at one point in the book, the point of view, which has been in John's first person the entire time, shifts to another character. And as I was reading the book, I was so taken aback and stunned by that move, partly because it was you, I think, and I as a fan of your work, reading mostly in the first person, I was just surprised to see the third person pronoun arrive on the page, but also because it felt so right that the book had burst forth from this analytical point of view into a deeply empathetic shift and switch. And my first question is very basic. Were you, as you were writing the book, as surprised by that move as I was as a reader, or was that something you had an inkling of pretty early on in the process?
I was also surprised, but I will say, as a side note, you personally shouldn't have been surprised. I hope it's a surprise for most readers, but I remember calling you in 2020 when I was with you. For people watching, Chris and I, you probably already know, but we've been friends for a little over a decade, and we're writer friends, and we dress the same. But when I was writing the book over pandemic, I called you and we were talking book stuff, as we do, mainly just complaining about other people's success, but sometimes talking about our own books. And I said that I was experimenting with writing from a different perspective in third person, which was something I'd never done in a book before, and I was feeling very trepidatious about it. And you said you were really excited, and you said finally, and you really encouraged me to do that. And that's something that, you know, Chris's book here, The Gimmicks, which I highly recommend purchasing. It's a wonderful book about professional wrestling, the Armenian genocide, and professional backgammon. I know what you're thinking again, but it's a really good book that's told from multiple points of view. And so you really encouraged me to do that. And I'm not just saying that because we were talking now. I said that at my last event too, at Politics and Prose here in DC, which, you know, was obviously attended by most of the White House. It was a real event, but I think about 80% of the book's told from the first person perspective that I was reading from. And then about 10% is told from Anatoly's perspective, and 10% is told from Natalia's perspective. And that was a really tricky thing for numerous reasons. But in the end, I ended up doing it partially because of the plot. The plot, I felt, required it. You know, the reader needed to know things that John didn't know. And he didn't know certain things, partly because he doesn't speak Ukrainian very well, and partly because of the way that his experiences and culture have sort of built his perspective, makes it so that he sees some things differently than some of the other characters in the book. But then also just for like basic stage work reasons, like he only has two eyes, he can only be in one place at once. So if the reader was going to learn certain things that they needed to know, either we need an omniscient narrator, which didn't feel right for this story, or we need multiple perspectives. And so that was like the just sort of nuts and bolts reason that it needed to happen. But on a deeper level, like just sort of like what I felt was like the heart of the book, it needed to happen because the more I wrote, the more it felt like it wasn't necessarily John's story so much as it was Natalia's story. And she just kind of started to steal the show in a very fun way. I mean, for me, it was fun. It's you know, it's kind of a heavy story sometimes, but the experience of writing it was fun. And I felt for that to be complete, we had to dip into her perspective. Which is why I did it. It does feel really risky because, you know, when I'm writing first person narrators who, they might not be just like me, but, you know, they're white men. the biggest thing I risk is people think I'm an asshole. Like, no one's going to read one of my characters and be like, oh, that's how white men are, because, we're very well represented. Ukrainian characters aren't, especially before the invasion, but even now, aren't super well represented in literature. So if I write a Ukrainian character, there's a bigger weight of representation on that. And also, I'm obviously not Ukrainian. So there's a real chance of screwing it up, and not only, bringing embarrassment to myself, but more than that, potentially causing hurt to Ukrainian readers, which is the last thing I want to do. So it's something I wrestled with a lot. But after thinking about it and writing about it and trying to find my way into like these characters, I felt like, I couldn't have written a third of the book from Natalia's point of view. I couldn't write her whole life. I couldn't even write a year in her life. But I think after all that work, I could spend 2 or 3 hours in her head and have that feel true, at least to who I thought she was and what I wanted to do. And I hope that it came across that way, but of course that's up to any reader to decide. But that was the hardest thing for me about writing this book, was having a new point of view like that.
It also, to me, speaks so directly to the thematic heart of the book, which is about communication and what it means to be honest with someone in language, and the limits of that understanding of another person. To shift points of view in the book felt so true to that thematic question in the book. Like, what is really going on in another person, and what glimpse can we have of that in a conversation? It felt really true. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really interesting point, and it's something that I really think a lot about the role of English in the world, or the role of English outside of primarily English-speaking countries. Whether I'm writing about Sweden or the Ukrainian situation, not the Ukraine, no, the. It's something that I consider a lot. And one thing that I find interesting when two characters are interacting in a language where at least one of them, it isn't their dominant language, is the things that you can say and can't say, but also the things you can't hide. Because sometimes I've at least had this experience when I'm speaking Swedish, for example, which, I'm bilingual. My mom's Swedish, my dad's American, but English does feel like my dominant language to me. It's certainly the language I'm most comfortable in. So when I'm speaking Swedish to someone, or definitely when I'm speaking Ukrainian, because I'm super bad at it, or a Ukrainian friend is speaking English to me, there is less room to hide, because you don't necessarily have the vocabulary to shroud or imply what you want to say. Sometimes you have to speak more directly. And when I'm speaking English to someone who doesn't have English as a first language, I find myself doing that as well, because in order to be understood, I need to speak more directly. So sometimes things get hidden, but sometimes things get revealed that wouldn't get revealed quite as soon. And I think you see that in some of the conversations that John and Natalia have, but also that like John and Dima have. And that was reflective of my experience with my Ukrainian friends when I was living there, and also now when we, Skype or chat or whatever, is that conversations followed a very different rhythm than what I was used to. And it might have been partly because of Ukrainian culture and American culture and those differences, but it was definitely in part because of language, because you said what you could say. And sometimes those transitions were unexpected, and the information you learned and the information you communicated was unexpected. So I do like, not only, not to go off on a different thing, but I'm really interested about the role of English in the world, but also just like as a device in writing, it's an interesting way to get characters to get to know each other differently.
And one of the great pleasures of reading this novel is that about halfway through, you're seeing that dynamic play out in all sorts of different personalities. And then you're, in the back of your mind, you're not thinking about this consciously as a reader, but you're thinking, is John, to what extent is the language barrier what's driving this tension and this comedy and this, has he always been like this? We don't get a lot of his life before he gets to Ukraine. So is this just part of his personality? Is this how he communicates? And just as you're beginning to feel the itch of that, you introduce another American, and it's one of the great comedic sequences in the novel, also one of the cringiest sequences in the novel, this really terrible date, one of the worst dates I've ever read, And it just, I guess this is not a question so much as putting over one of my favorite moments in the book, where it felt like you were anticipating a question about language before the reader had a chance to really like ask for it. And again in this book, I found myself just in such good hands, just trusting you totally. So every move you made just felt right. I really, really loved this book, and I can't wait for more and more people to read it. With that, can I bring in questions from the audience and bring in a larger conversation here?
I mean, you can, but I don't think you need to yet. You're giving me so many compliments. I kind of want to stay here, but maybe we can invite people to type in the Q&A, and I can just respond to what you just said for just a minute. And then, if people have questions they want to formulate, they are free to type them in the Q&A. But I think that the second American character Chris is referring to is that John goes on a date with a Peace Corps volunteer named Muriel. Doesn't go great. But she is an important character for the story because, one, she's lived in Ukraine longer, and she can explain information to John in a way that is designed for an American to understand it. And that really changes the context of how he understands Ukraine. Because audience matters. Like, this book that I wrote is meant for an American audience. It's not necessarily meant for a Ukrainian audience. If Ukrainian readers like it, that's fantastic, but this is meant for an American audience. And Muriel gets a lot of information that I think historically and politically is important for the reader to know. And she gets it into the book without, it feeling like, or hopefully without it feeling like, oh, here's a break for Wikipedia. But she also says a lot of stuff that's wrong. And John starts to realize as they're talking that she has kind of a skewed negative view of Ukraine. Not on all things, but on some things. And I think that, like, when you're living in another country, you often, when you meet someone from your home country, your favorite thing is to complain about the country you live in and be like, oh, everything's so bad here. Like, look how they stand in line. Like, coffee's terrible, all that stuff. And I think that can be cathartic and nice, but also at some points it like crosses a line and it turns into disrespect. And I think Muriel crosses that line, and that becomes an important, it becomes an important thing for John. And of course, the language thing, since we only have him in the US for, I think, like 10 pages, maybe less than that, it becomes a way to bring the US to him, I guess. So thank you for that.
And we will have the opportunity for Chris to shower you with more compliments, I believe.
Excellent. Good.
We have only one question in the Q&A at the moment, but please, if you're watching, feel free to submit your questions and I'll be sure to ask them. Christy asks, I believe your first published novel, Such Good Work, started out as a short story. Did you know from the beginning that this story would be a novel versus a short story? If so, how is the writing experience different working on something that you knew from the start would have a broader scale?
Yeah, that's a good question. And Christy's right. My first novel did start out as a short story, and then a second short story, and then a third short story, and then a fourth short story. And then after I'd written 4 from that perspective, I started joining them together as a novel. I think at that point I had to trick myself into writing a novel. I think it felt so daunting, and I had already written like 4 failed novels. So I think that it was also like, to be quite honest, just like a lot of reading short fiction, going to grad school, like short fiction was kind of ingrained in my brain. So that felt like a way to navigate that. And that felt like a comfortable space. Now, I haven't tried to write a short story since 2015. I don't hate short fiction or anything. I just needed a break. I kind of got my fill after all the school and teaching and stuff. So when I didn't know that I was going to write a novel about Ukraine when I was living in Ukraine. I always keep a journal. So I write a lot and just, throw all that mess in there. You never know what you're going to need until later. So I didn't know what I was going to write with it, but I think I was thinking more nonfiction book or novel. And then when I got back to the US, and we've been back for about 6 months, I always end up writing. I move around a lot. My partner and I now move around a lot. I always end up writing about the different places I've lived, but I rarely end up writing until I've left those places. I find it very hard to write about a place while I'm still there. It's only after I've been back or in a new place for like 6 months or more that I start to kind of be able to contextualize what that place meant to me and what I want to say about it. So when I started writing Calling Ukraine, I did intend to write it as a novel. Earlier versions were way different from this one. You know, in the first draft, I think I wrote the first draft in about 10 or 11 months in 2020. It was a slow year. It's a good year to write a novel. But the first 50 or so pages take place in Kyiv, in the Ukrainian capital. And there's a lot of stuff about Stalin's ideas about city planning and how those affect the contemporary pedestrian experience of post-Soviet architecture, which is not a great way to start a novel that doesn't even take place in that city. So the first person who read the book said, you might want to cut those first 50 pages. And it ended up, I think in the new novel, there's 3 pages in Kyiv instead of 50. So a lot of things were different, but I did know that I wanted to write it as a novel. And I think that looking at the difference between novel and nonfiction, the problem with writing it as nonfiction was that my time in Ukraine was too happy. You know, there were certainly difficulties, and we had a lot of, or I had a lot of trouble navigating the culture and the language and all these things. So it wasn't like it was all perfect, but I was there with the person I love, and you know, that always makes things nice. It's not great for a book because it's just like there's too little conflict. So I think that a novel, you know, my favorite professor used to say, a novel's like a bag. You can put anything you want in there. So the great thing about doing it as a novel is I could put the story and then I could sneak all this essayistic stuff in there too. Thank you, Christy, for that question.
Thank you. Lisa writes, how have your Ukrainian friends reacted to your book? For a Ukrainian American like myself, it was awesome.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. I really appreciate that. That's so wonderful to hear. And I have to admit that I've heard from more Ukrainian American readers than Ukrainian readers living in Ukraine for a number of reasons. But every time I do it, it means so much. So I appreciate you saying that. Not too many Ukrainian friends I know who are back in Ukraine have read my book, partially because, I mean, it's not available for purchase in Ukraine right now. I hope that at some point it'll be translated into Ukrainian, but I think that there are more important things going on in Ukrainian art right now than my writing, which is meant more for an American audience. But you know, my friends over there who have seen the book or seen parts of it have been very supportive and kind, as they always are. You know, I did have a very thorough Ukrainian reader, a professor at the Lesia Ukrainka Eastern European University in Lutsk, who I hired to help me kind of fact check the transliterated Ukrainian and just make sure I didn't, you know, I tried to research it as much as I can, but I really didn't want to make any mistakes. So she read it very carefully with me and really helped me out, catch some things that I slipped up on accidentally. And she has been lovely and supportive. And, you know, I've also gotten some feedback from some Ukrainian readers. I mean, not directly, just people have written about it, being really upset. I think one reader in particular thought that all the negative things that characters say about Ukraine was my impression of Ukraine. So I introduced some stereotypes and I hope to counter those. But she took it as me, you know, furthering those stereotypes and believing those stereotypes. And it sounded like she was very angry and hurt. And that's, I don't blame her. That's totally her prerogative. And she, you know, she is free to read it that way. Of course, that made me very sad. But at the same time, it's like, it's really hard to read a novel, not only in a different language, but also like during wartime. So I don't expect everyone to like it as much as I would enjoy that. But most of the feedback I've gotten from Ukrainians, the people I know, has been very positive. And the feedback, especially I've gotten from Ukrainian Americans, it seems like that's been lovely. So thank you. And I really appreciate you saying that.
Amy writes, could you talk about your relationship with boxing?
My relationship to boxing is that I'm not very good at it. But I think that question comes because there's a thread about boxing in the book. And in real life, I used to box in Portland. John goes boxing in Ukraine. He's invited by a friend to go boxing in Ukraine, and it's a comic scene, and it also ends up serving a purpose later in the book. I did not go boxing in Ukraine, but one of my friends there, we're having coffee one day, and he asked me if I liked Marvel movies, and I said, I'm not really a fan of Marvel movies. And he said, I was going to invite you. To see a Marvel movie, but do you like Ultimate Fighting? And I didn't want to say no. I don't really like Ultimate Fighting. I kind of like boxing, but I think Ultimate Fighting is kind of barbaric. So he said, you know, like UFC, mixed martial arts. I said, oh yeah, you know, thinking we'd watch a fight or something. And he's like, that's great. I do Ultimate Fighting. Do you want to come fight? And my head, I was like, no, I don't want to do that. That sounds terrible. So I didn't. I came up with an excuse, and we went for a nice walk instead. But in real life, I boxed just for fun at a gym in Portland when we lived there. And it's not very good at it, but I think one of the great things about boxing is that, like, if you have anxiety, as I do, and if you have an overactive brain, it's a great way to turn it off, because you can't worry about stuff when you're about to get punched in the face. You just have to not get punched in the face, which is lovely. I had a wonderful boxing, she owned the gym. She was this 60-something woman from the East Coast with this smoker's cough. And she taught me how to box, because I had never boxed in a gym before. And then she said one day, she's like, when are you gonna, I was doing like beginner boxing. She's like, when are you gonna go up to the advanced group? I was like, I don't know. Do you think I'm ready for it? And she was just like, baby bird needs to leave the nest. So I went and did some boxing. But I think Jeff Dyer said that every time an American writer writes about boxing, they're trying to get into the ring with Hemingway. And that, you know, I'm approaching it from more of a comic scene. Most of what the boxing is about is trying to communicate in different languages and trying to form a connection with a person. Can't say I love reading Hemingway or Mailer or any of those guys on boxing. But I like some good comedy, and I do enjoy boxing. It's fun. So I guess that's my relationship. You know, if you like writers who box, Laura Vandenberg, the great writer, I don't know how much she writes about it, but on Instagram, she's just killing people in the ring. So if you're a fan of boxing and literature, Laura Vandenberg.
I think we have time for one more question. Kelly writes, when is the movie coming out?
When is the movie coming out? Well, that's a really good question. To all the Hollywood producers in the audience, it's out on submission now. No, well, it would be delightful if this was a movie. There aren't any plans at the moment, but I did meet with my film and TV agent a month or two ago, and we talked about it and how we were going to pitch it. And that was actually, at that meeting, that was the first time that I realized that this book is partly a workplace satire. I don't know how I missed that, because I wrote it. But she was talking about pitching it to streamers as a TV show. And she said that, that a workplace satire, that's a great way to pitch it. And I said, oh, why would you pitch it as workplace satire? And she was like, because of the content, which I think is fair. But yeah, of course, I would love it if a filmmaker could turn this into a movie, or if a terrible filmmaker could buy the option and then never exercise it, because then they purchase the right to make the movie, and then they have to renew it every year and pay you every year, but they never make it. That would be fine too. So great filmmaker making it, terrible filmmaker buying the option. If you know anyone from either category, please let them know, because I'm looking. But thank you for that question, Kelly.
Thank you. Chris, we have a little bit of time left. Excuse me. I wanted to leave a last question or final thoughts to you.
Well, I don't want to end by asking the cliche, what are you working on next, Johannes? Although, of course, I am deeply curious. So if you can kind of squeeze that answer into this question, that'd be great.
Well,
yeah.
I know my dad's watching, and he's going to be delighted because he always asks that question, and I never tell him until it's done. Because he's such a lovely, enthusiastic supporter. But then every time I talk to him, he's like, "When's the novel going to be done?" So I have to hold off. But Dad, if you're in the audience, I am working on a novel. I'm about 40,000 words into it. All those 40,000 words are really bad, but the good ones are going to start coming soon, I'm pretty sure. Just writing my way towards them. And it is about, at least at this stage, it's about the narrator from my first book, Jonas, and Natalia from my second book. And they are involved in a project to raise money to buy drones for the war in Ukraine. And there's a bunch of other stuff. And who knows if that will actually end up being the book, but that's what I'm working on right now. And I'm also working on, I've got a piece coming out next week, hopefully, or maybe the week after, about this awesome Ukrainian arts collective that's become a hub for military fundraising called Angar. They do incredible work. So I'm really excited about that. Hopefully in the fall, I'm going to have an essay coming out about the Swedish writer Stig Dagerman, who's a fascinating guy who wrote 10 canonical books in 4 years from the ages of 22 to 26, then had 5 years of writer's block and killed himself. And he is a really interesting writer in person. So I'm excited to hopefully have that come out later in the year. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Thank you. You can purchase Calling Ukraine from Literati Bookstore, and the link in the chat. If you're in Ann Arbor, you can stop in this weekend and pick up a physical copy yourself. I hope to have you both in the store in the not too distant future. But Johannes Lichtman, Chris McCormick, thank you so much for joining us this evening on At Home with Literati. Thank you to all of our attendees for joining us as well on a Friday evening.
Thank you, Chris. And thanks everyone for watching. Really appreciate it.
Take care all. Have a great night.